And joining us right now is Nile Gardiner. He is the former British Foreign Policy Director under Margaret Thatcher. Sir, it's good to have you on the program. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Maria.
So where are you in this? Talk to us about the implications that you see under a Leave or Remain vote.
Well, my view is that Brexit actually will be very good for Britain. It will be good for Europe. It will be good for the United States as well. And I would urge your viewers to ignore the scaremongering that's being projected actually by the Remain camp in this referendum vote. And I do see Brexit being really about British sovereignty and self-determination, the right of the British people to decide their own future in Europe. At the moment, as a member of the European Union, Britain is not a truly sovereign nation. The EU decides up to 2/3 of British law. The European Union courts can overrule British courts. Britain cannot even negotiate its own free trade agreements. Brexit would result in Britain retaking control of its own laws with a renewed right now to be able to negotiate its own free trade deals across the world, including with the United States. I think there will be tremendous economic benefits for Great Britain and also for America as well. After all, the US-UK economic partnership is the biggest bilateral partnership in the world. And I think that the United States has a very big interest in what happens in the United Kingdom today. But I do see Brexit as very beneficial for Britain and for America as well.
Interesting take because of all of the pushback on the other side of the argument. What do you say to those who say, look, the Brits are going to have to renegotiate all of those trade deals. They're going to have to get a seat in the WTO, and they're going to have all new regulation, which will create all of this uncertainty for business, who is probably going to take money out and resources out of the UK and put it into continental Europe.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I would say, firstly, Great Britain is the world's 5th largest economy. And for some years, it has been the most successful major economy in Europe. I would expect that to continue being the case with Britain outside of the European Union. And there was a great deal, I think, of scaremongering over the euro issue when there was a big debate in Britain about whether to join the European single currency. And at that time, the IMF, the World Bank, international leaders all over the world were warning Britain that if it didn't join the single currency, Britain would be isolated, the city of London would decline. Quite the opposite has happened, actually, and you've seen capital flowing into London from outside of the Eurozone, well, sorry, from inside the Eurozone. And I think that you're going to see, frankly, a similar effect happening in the coming years as economic decline continues to seep into the Eurozone, into the European Union. Also, I think you're going to see great political uncertainty across the EU in the coming years. Tremendous challenges being faced by the EU. I think Britain will be seen as a very important safe haven, actually, for European and global capital. And I think the City of London, once it's freed from the shackles of EU financial regulation, will actually boom and prosper.
Wow, that's really interesting. Panel, weigh in.
Now, I want to raise this issue that, and I'm going to quote from the Wall Street Journal editorial page, tipping my hat to James Freeman, who's sitting there. But the being part of the EU, has it really gotten in the way of serious reform in Britain? You could have cut your corporate tax rate. You could have followed some of the kind of deregulation ideas and free market ideas from Tory Michael Gove, for example. So is really not being part of the EU going to change the mindset and the think within the nation? Well, I'm glad you mentioned Michael Gove, of course, who has been one of the leaders of the Brexit campaign. And it is striking that if you look at the leadership of the Brexit side, they are overwhelmingly free marketeers. They're in favor of deregulation. Many are in favor of cutting Britain's corporate tax rate. And I think that, Great Britain outside of the EU will be far more competitive. And the European Union really has a suffocating effect, I think, in terms of strangling the British economy with a huge amount of over-regulation. Wow. And the European Union really worships at the trough of big government and over-regulation. There's a reason why President Obama is such a big supporter of the European Union, the European project, because I think that the EU shares with President Obama a big government, high-tax, interventionist mindset. And I think that Britain outside of the EU will be far more of an unregulated
economy. It will be a far more of a free market-based economy.
Yeah.
And I think that economic freedom is going to be significantly advanced in Britain as a result of this.
James Freeman, jump in.
Well, I was glad Dagan stood up for my colleagues because I actually disagree with them on this. I think Britain should leave, and the question you talked about the lack of sovereignty. It's also just a fundamentally anti-democratic institution. Matt Ridley wrote in our pages this week that the EU has 4 presidents, none of them elected. You have this parliament at the EU, but to initiate legislation, that comes from unelected bureaucrats who make those calls. And by the way, Britain, I think we'd have to say you have made some progress cutting the corporate tax rate.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that, there's a fundamental democratic deficit with regard to the European Union, with unelected, faceless bureaucrats in the European Commission deciding laws across the EU. There are, in fact, 5 EU presidents, and I think that 99% of the British people wouldn't be able to name more than 1 or 2 of those. Yes. And so that's the current state of the European Union.
Okay, question on trade. You get out of the EU under this scenario. Let's assume people vote to leave. Ridley also is saying that basically with the internet and the WTO bringing down trade barriers around the world, bringing down tariffs, I should say, it's not that big a benefit to be in the EU versus what it used to be. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think Britain is far better off outside the EU in terms of negotiating its own free trade deals. And I think there's actually significant momentum on Capitol Hill for a US-UK free trade deal. Senator Ted Cruz has talked about it. Paul Ryan's talked about it. And I think that in contrast to what President Obama said to the British people, the UK would be at the front of the queue for a free trade deal with the United States. And after all, President Obama is only going to be around for another few more months. But I think that Brexit will have, I think, a tremendous impact in terms of advancing economic freedom, economic liberty, actually, on both sides of the Atlantic.
So
and that can only be a good thing.
As we wrap up then, Niall, let me get Mike Murphy in here for a moment. Then why are markets so nervous about an exit, Mike? Because we're seeing a rally in stocks this morning, really nice global rally, because of this expectation that they'll remain.
Absolutely. And that's what I wanted to touch on, is the markets and the impact on the markets. Because when you look at it this morning, the global markets rallying, I think they're telling you that the Britain is going to stay in the EU. So I wanted to ask Niall here, if the people vote and the vote comes in close, Niall, similar to what happened here in the U.S. in the 2000 election, can you see this under any scenario being a contested election, or where there's some sort of pushback on who the actual winner is?
That's a very good question, and the polling really going into today's referendum is really neck and neck. Of course, there has been some momentum, I think, on the Brexit side over the past two weeks, but it's going to be an extremely tight poll. I don't know if there could be some sort of recount if it's extremely close. That remains to be seen. But one thing's for sure, I think if Britain votes to leave the European Union, then I think it's likely that David Cameron would either have to step down or be replaced in a leadership contest in the Conservative Party. So I think that the Prime Minister has a great deal resting on the outcome of today's vote.
All right, we will leave it there now.